Good morning. It is very wonderful to be invited by Anacapa School, and I'm really grateful to be here and address all the students and with the video, the parents, and whoever might be watching. My name is Karin Finell. I'm from Berlin, and I have witnessed the war at close quarters, actually too close quarters, and I'm here to tell you about it, what I have experienced. Just this morning, I have this little thing on the computer that comes up every day with a little aphorism for the day. It's from the Nuclear Peace Foundation, and it said, "The least I can do is speak out for those who cannot speak for themselves," by Jane Goodall. But it is also what Susan Sontag said after she had gone to Germany and had witnessed the terrible devastation of so many German cities, that she said, we have to speak for those who are dead and who have lost their voice and who are still in the rubble. And she wrote some very wonderful articles about what Germans suffered. Now, most of us Germans are just now coming around and talking about what we have witnessed, because we felt very guilty after the war, because we, after all, Hitler was a German, or rather Austrian really, but he was our leader, and he was not voted in by the majority of the people, but he was, after all, had seized the power. And then when we found out the horrors the Germans had committed against the Jews and against the Slavs and against the Russians and the other Slavic peoples, it was too much. We had lost everything. I think I would rather read this to you now, because I may not be able to speak in the right sequence. There's too much to remember. When after the war, the truth of the atrocities committed during the Hitler years was revealed, we felt numb. All of us had suffered losses, some not only the death of loved ones and homes through the bombs, but many who had flocked to Berlin in the last months of the war had lost their former Heimat, the land of their fathers. That was in East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, where I was born, and many other countries that were really the richest corn and wheat and bread yielding provinces of Germany. Losses had robbed people of feeling, many of whom I saw wandering in the streets, giving the impression they were floundering, like fish emptied onto the deck of a boat, where they flip in aimless jumps. The faces of people expressed a numb horror, resembling shell-shocked soldiers returning from the front. People had lost a sense of belonging. Not only did they lose loved ones, but they also lost their place in the history of their country. A once decent country with moral values. Germany had been the most educated country of all the European countries. It had the highest literacy rate. It had wonderful writers, Goethe, Schiller, Heinrich Heine, who was forbidden under Hitler, by the way, because he was Jewish, Rilke, so many more, I cannot name them all. And it had the wonderful composers. And all of this reputation of a once wonderful nation was destroyed within 12 years by one mad man. They once knew who they were. Now they realized they had been duped. And those who had voted for Hitler had voted for a monster. If they had not voted for him, they knew they had closed their eyes to a deadly tidal wave, destroying everything in its wake. The wave had washed over them. They came up for air, now seeing the destruction and loss of everything that once had been. They could not cope. It is said that the death of someone close affects the physical body of the survivor. The body then goes through different stages of mourning. And now, much like a family that mourns a member's death, Germans needed time to weep for their loss. But they dared not weep, for the loss of Germany and their way of life also included Hitler. Would weeping then be interpreted as weeping for the Führer? I was young, and though weighed down by guilt, I did not mourn what I had lost. I looked forward to a new country, to be born out of the ashes. Living in Berlin made us acutely aware of the present moment. Berliners had endured unspeakable horrors during the last weeks of the war from the Russians when they came in. They raped over 100,000 women, 10,000 of whom had then committed suicide. They left a wake of syphilis, of children who were unwanted, women who got pregnant, of destroyed women, really, morally destroyed, serial raping of the young, of the old, of everyone. And as it is with individuals who have suffered grief, so the people of Berlin began to look inward. Living in Berlin, however, was akin to balancing on a tightrope. There was always the question in the back of our minds, would the US risk going to war with the Soviet Union over this German city? This came a little bit later after the war in 48 to 49. It's also covered in my book, the war of the airlift, when America did come to our rescue. They would not leave us to the Russians. What if the Russian bear invaded our western sector? We Berliners did not have the leisure to grow complacent and enjoy material goods as did our brother citizens in West Germany. There, after the currency reform and the ensuing economic miracle precipitated by the Marshall Plan, people concentrated on cars, on refrigerators, and luxuries. The people of Berlin lived more simply, within their own time capsule, and under the shadow of the blockade, when we had less food than at any other time during the war, less contaminated by consumerism. People often ask me, wasn't it horrible to be a child during the war? Yes, it was. Wars are not for children or for other living things, as a half-forgotten 70s slogan proclaimed. But even though I grew up with bombs falling all around, with seeing dead body parts decaying in bombed buildings, of coming upon a man-child strung up as a traitor on a lamppost, even though I myself narrowly escaped death several times, in spite of all of that, I had a happy childhood. I was loved by my mother, my grandmother, my uncles, and learned that love is the most important ingredient in growing up. Love sustained me through bombs and destruction. I learned about impermanence and the transience of life when I was young. You may own something today, but tomorrow it may be gone. Nothing is permanent. In war, there is total equality. When one is hungry and everyone else is starving too, hunger is a growl in the stomach, but it can be tolerated. During my childhood, we were all in it together. I wanted to contrast that with Angela's Ashes, where the little Irish boy was so hungry, but there were the neighborhoods where people had everything to eat, and there were riches on the table when you looked through the windows, when their mother and his brothers and sisters were starving. We were all hungry. Only a few black marketeers and a few Nazi heads had something to eat. The sepulchral shadows of Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and Ravensbrück have not diminished over the years. Rather, they have grown more prominent as I try to gain more of an understanding of what it means to be a German, born under the swastika, the Hakenkreuz. My collective guilt extends far beyond the horrors of concentration camps at this time. It seems as if Hitler had opened a Pandora's box and let out evil, infecting the globe. The Hakenkreuz, a formerly peaceful symbol used in Paleolithic caves and still in use in India and Buddhist countries, was tragically misused by the Nazis. I have written this book with guilt on my shoulders, and one of the very strange things that happened to me, maybe I will relate it after I read this from my book, because it will make more sense to you then. This is a chapter out of my book, sort of 1/3 through the book, and it's April 27th now, 1945. The book begins 1939. Oh, I should mention the reason for the title, Goodbye to the Mermaids, comes from the fact that my mother was an artist, and she was also a weaver and craftsperson, but mainly she was a painter and a costume designer, later on at the Berlin State Opera House. But she and I were on this little island off the coast of Denmark, a German island, on the 1st of September, when Hitler marched into Poland. I was at the seashore. I was not supposed to go there by myself. I was barely 6 years old and ran ahead of her and put my toes into the water and was looking out, hoping I would see a mermaid. I loved Hans Christian Andersen, and he sustained me all through the war with his fairy tales, which I loved even more than the Brother Grimm fairy tales. But fairy tales were my saviors, actually. I would go off into a different world. But mainly because I loved water so much, I would go down to the lakes in Berlin or wherever there was water, and I thought, well, maybe some mermaid will turn up here and she will have lost her way and gone upstream and come here into a lake in Berlin. But no such luck. I never saw a mermaid. But they were my friends. They were my imaginary friends. So here I was at the seashore, and the waves are coming in, and I'm looking out. And my mother is coming down over the dunes. We lived in an old fisherman's house right by the water. And she says, Karin, Karin, you must come up. You must come up. And I thought somebody had died. And then we went back, she and I, to the little house, and she turned on the radio, and Hitler's voice was coming over the radio, and he was telling the nation that he had dispatched the troops that day to invade Poland. He could not get them to return the German lands that were ceded to Poland after World War I. And this was a thing that most Germans felt very adamant about, that we had lost so much land after World War I. And the Versailles Peace Treaty was very unfair, actually. So Hitler wanted to get the lands back, and that was the first thing. He needed Lebensraum, which means room to live, and invaded Poland with the result that 12 years later, he lost more land, Germany lost more land than ever, than after World War I. But anyway, my mother turned on the radio, and then she cried, and she said, he's mad now. England and France, they have a treaty with Poland. They will declare war on Germany. We will be in another world war. And of course I didn't know what England was, and she said, she told me it was an island. Oh, like the little island we're on? No, it's a little bit bigger than that. And France, I knew, was a wonderful country with champagne, my mother's white leather gloves, and perfume. But that was all I knew about those two countries. And now we would be at war with all of them. And the next night, we had neighbors there who were also summering in the island. And they would come over in the evening, and they had schnapps, and they had pretzels, and they said to my mother, don't yell so loud, the windows are all open, because she kept saying, well, this man is a madman, and he's crazy. He's a megalomaniac, Größenwahn in German. And they said, they're going to put you in jail. Don't speak like this about Hitler. And don't you know you have a child upstairs you have to keep alive for this child? And now I was really scared. She hadn't come up to kiss me goodnight yet. I was lying in my little bed, shivering and shaking with fear. And after a while, I decided, I'm not going to listen to this anymore. They're all screaming down there, mainly my mother. And I'm going to go down to the beach and look for mermaids. And I knew we would pack up and we would leave the next morning. We would go back to Frankfurt, where we lived at the time. And the next year we went to Berlin in 1940. So I went, tiptoed out the back entrance, down to the beach, and I sat there and put my feet into the water, which had spuming foam, phosphorescent. It was very beautiful and very quiet. And I said, goodbye, goodbye to the mermaids. And that's where the title came from. So now back to the book. Several years have passed. This was 1939, 1st of September. Now we're on April 27, 1945. We had been bombed out meanwhile, and in Berlin, and my parents were divorced, and I every so often, first I was evacuated, children were evacuated in the war. We couldn't stay in Berlin. We were evacuated with our teachers and our German youth leaders who were indoctrinating us with things about Hitler, his youth, etc., etc. And he was our great father, and I loved Hitler at the time. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I did. I thought he would be strong, and he would be good for us. And I argued with my grandmother, who was raised in Utah. When she was 6 months old, her parents arrived in Utah, and she came back to Germany when she was 15, and she felt she was a total American, and spoke English with me quite often, and I learned English when I was a little girl. So I argued with both of them, and they were afraid sometimes that I might go to school and say something that would get them into trouble, because they were not of my same opinion. And when they said something about or against Hitler, then they tried to convince me that he was really a mad megalomaniac. I said, well, he is not, and when he does something wrong, it's because he has bad advisors. And they said, if he has bad advisors and he doesn't know better than they, then he should not be our Führer, our leader. So the war is ended now. We know that there is no winning, and I came to my conclusions pretty late that he was a madman, but this is the chapter in which I do. Oma, my grandmother, struggled with her shoes, tying frayed laces. Where are you going? Ah, Karin. The butcher is the only place still open, and he too is closing shop today. Frau Baumann said he's selling everything out. She hefted herself from the chair and grabbed the string shopping bag. But Oma, they're shooting from the church tower. I have to go. Who knows when we'll be able to buy meat again. This is our last chance. I slid on my stocking feet across the wooden floor and landed on her, throwing her back into the chair. I'll go, I said, getting up and putting on my boots. You'll do no such thing, Oma said, but I cut her short and put my hand over her mouth. Not very respectful, but effective. No, Karin, she cried, freeing herself from my hand, trying to hold me back. But I'd already snatched the net bag, torn the ration cards from her hand, and the Geldbörse with the crumpled paper money and coins, and before she could argue any further, I was out the door, straddling the banister, sliding down each section of the mahogany railing. I heard her shouting after me, come back, right now!" And a few minutes later in a meeker tone, "Be careful, child." When I reached the entrance door, I turned and yelled up the long stairwell, "I can run, Oma. You can't. Don't worry. I'll be back real quick." I was the only one in physical shape to go. Grandmother suffered from angina pectoris, and Mother was still recovering from her escapade on Hitler's last birthday. There was no food. There was no choice. The heavy door closed behind me with a thud. My heart raced. I had to pee, but I didn't want to go back to the apartment. "I can hold it. I'm scared, that's all," I tried to convince myself. There were valid reasons for my fear. The nightly air raid warnings had from one day to the next given way to Russian planes dropping bombs at any time, at any place. They also flew low and fired machine guns at people moving in the streets. But worst of all, one of the Russian tanks surrounding Berlin had broken through the German lines, and 3 or 4 soldiers were holed up in the tower of the half-bombed Hochmeister Church, half a block from us, shooting at any human target. Once on the street, I looked over my shoulder to the church behind me. All was quiet, and seeing no one else about, I crept along, hugging the walls of apartment buildings, keeping my eyes to the ground. Then I reached the intersection of Johann-Georg-Straße with Kurfürstendamm. What? I barely missed running into a pair of dirty military boots, dangling at eye level. My eyes followed upward and quickly looked away. But then my eyes were drawn, as if by a magnet, to the figure swinging from the lamppost. A Schutzwehr soldier of our home defense, appearing to be no more than 14 years old, hung from this old-fashioned street light. His face was red and blotched, his features bloated into a grotesque mask. I backed up slowly. His blackened tongue protruded from cracked lips, while his dead eyes stared at nothingness, glazed and bulging. I felt vomit swelling up. I swallowed hard, sucking in my lips, trying not to look, and yet I couldn't stop staring at this figure, which made me weak and ill to my stomach, all at the same time. A huge wave of sadness mixed with anger swept over me. I read the crude cardboard sign pinned to the boy's narrow chest. Ich bin zu feige, Berlin zu verteidigen, deshalb hänge ich hier. It looked as if it had been scribbled on the spot. I am too cowardly to defend Berlin, that's why I'm hanging here. Something smelled like excrements. I held my nose. There were dark, red stains between his legs. Was this what death smelled like? How could this be? He was still a boy, a few years older than I, but a boy, hanging from the lamppost. Unter der Laterne, the beginning lines of the wartime song Lily Marlene, but as everything else in our surreal world, even this lilting song had been turned upside down. Underneath the lamppost, no longer a lover's promise to return from the war, but here, the future lament of a mother for her dead son. I trudged on, down the Kurfürstendamm, then across the Hallenseebrücke, a wide railroad bridge. Soon the elegant Kudamm, with its shops, changed into the Königsallee, an urban street lined with elms. Here was the beginning of Grunewald, the section of town where grand villas from the 19th century stood, and where close by a deep forest connected the city with the exclusive suburbs ringing Berlin's lakes. I passed stately apartment buildings riddled with shrapnel, their windows broken and patched with cardboard or wood. In front of some half-bombed villas, early lilacs bloomed purple amid the yellow and orange of isolated tulips, mingling their springtime, peacetime perfume with the acrid odor of war, of fires, and explosives. I felt sick to my stomach again. The boy soldier's image stirred behind my eyelids. I tried to make it go away, run faster, but the specter of his body swinging in the wind kept pace, moving just as fast as my legs would carry me. I reached the butcher. The shop, with its white tiles smeared with red animal blood, felt stifling. The blood sausage lying behind glass counters gave off its peculiar metallic odor, mixed with salt and garlic and other spices. Frau Baumann, from our apartment building, as well as other women I knew to be living next door, were standing in queue, nodding hello to me. I probably sounded as if I had a cold, talking through a willfully blocked-up nose, so I would not have to inhale the blood and meat odor while trying to forget the dead soldier. The drone of low-flying Russian planes could be heard, and explosions of intermittent bombs. Some of the women made fun of the clumsy Soviet planes. I did not think those planes were anything to laugh at. The Russian planes did not saturation bomb like American or British planes. Still, they caused enough damage. I watched as the last of my neighbors paid. 2 more customers were ahead of me. I was terrified by the idea of having to go home by myself with bombs exploding nearby, and hopped from foot to foot, as if that would make the butcher sell the sausages faster. Frau Baumann received her wrapped package, and having observed my tapping feet and drumming fingers, asked, "Are you nervous, Karin? Scared?" "Me? Scared? No way," I lied. "Good. You're a Deutsches Mädel. German girls are not afraid." I asked, "Please, would you wait for me? I'll be right along. We can all walk together." "We'll walk slowly. You can catch us up." They left and closed the door behind them. Through the glass door, I saw them walk at a normal pace. How could I possibly catch up? When it was my turn, I stuffed the sausages and meat and a few soup bones into my head bag and ran after them. I ran as fast as I could, ran out of breath. Damn, my side stitches again. I had to stop. I doubled over, held my breath. Then I ran again, hunched over, the pain making it impossible to straighten up. I was gaining on the women and hollered, "Wait!" I heard my cry fade. My mouth was wide open, but there was no sound. My legs were moving, but it felt as if I were running in place. The distance between the women and myself was not lessening. Above me, the drone of a plane had grown louder and louder and louder. Now directly overhead, the plane was one enormous hum. Then a huge bang exploded the air. A great yellow-orange light leapt up. My mouth, still open, opened wider, wider still in a scream, keeping the noise from tearing my eardrums. The blast threw me to the ground. After what seemed a long time, I dared open my eyes. Stared. The bomb had struck the bridge. Iron girders, like the blackened ribs of a carcass, struck the smoking sky. Concrete lay heaped in a pile of rubble. Clothing, I recognized, was strewn about, in bits of human debris, parts of bodies. An arm with a hand still clutching a patent leather purse had been hurled near to where I crouched. My neighbors. A moment ago they had been alive, walking, chattering. Now they were torn pieces of flesh. I held my mouth, but this time I couldn't stop it. I vomited, again and again. It ran through my fingers. My stomach kept convulsing long after it was empty. Then I rose and wiped my hands on the yellow-green of a forsythia bush. My hands smelled putrid, and my mouth tasted foul. I ran. The bridge was impassable. I knew there was another, smaller footbridge, not far off to the right. I found it, but it had no railings. Had it never had railings? I looked down from the height of a 2-story building to the network of train tracks below. I have always been afraid of heights, but I had to cross this 4-foot-wide bridge with nothing to hold on to. I slung the string bag over my shoulder, gripped the loop handles with my teeth, and lowered myself onto hands and knees. Slowly, I crawled across. I made it to the other side. Then I took in a full breath, exhaled, relief. The Hochmeister Church, where the Russian hid in the steeple, lay a block ahead of me. I crept along the buildings. Suddenly there were shots. Machine gun fire. Da-da-da-da-duck. Bullets hit the pavement. Ping, ping, ping. Bits of cement from the sidewalk left small whirls of grey dust, while bullets carved neat holes into the stone facade of an apartment building to my left. I crouched, taking shelter in the arch of an entrance door. I tried to hide, ducking my head between my knees, like an ostrich, while my front was fully exposed. The bullets kept flying, ricocheting. They hit the street, and like pebbles thrown onto a lake, bounced across the pavement in skipping jumps. And then, just a sudden silence. The shooting stopped. I took another deep breath. Had they realized they were shooting at a child? Our apartment building was half a block away. I ran home faster than I had ever run. Halfway through the door, I aimed the bag with its meat onto the kitchen table. It hit the table with a hard, dead thud. On my bed, I buried my head in a pillow. I did not speak to anyone of what I had witnessed, not for a long time. I tried to make sense of what I had seen, and I could not. The inside of my head sizzled, buzzed, as if my brain had been filled with an overload of electricity. Was everything Hitler had told us a lie? It came quite suddenly, this feeling of clarity, as if someone had ripped the dark veil from my head, which had clouded my vision. Yes, the Führer had lied. He had lied all along. There would be no Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon promised to save us at the last minute. That too was a lie. Berlin would fall to the Russians. The Führer could not protect us. He was hiding somewhere in his bunker, and he and all of us were doomed. That afternoon I lost my hope. While living within a world of fantasy, I could handle the bombs, the lack of food, the uncertainty of tomorrow. But now it was as if I had awakened from a long sleep. I realized I had been blind and deaf to what I had seen or heard from my family and others around me. I had refused to see the truth. Like a draft horse trudging his course, pulling a wagon, I had worn blinders. How did that happen? I shook my head. Hitler had been able to put blinders on so many of us. These past few hours had torn mine off. Illusions and hope were gone, lay at my feet like the shriveled pieces of rubber of a burst balloon. Nothing made sense. I had seen women alive and chattering, then torn to bits all within seconds. But worse, I had seen this murdered boy, close to my own age, unter der Laterne, a sweet, plaintive song. Now a Klagelied, a song of woe, to the tune of which a child soldier swung in a dance of death in the April wind. I could speak more about what the Russians did when they came in, but some of it I was told by a Ukrainian who was in our apartment building, and he was shielding us actually from the hordes of Russians coming through. We all lived in the basement at the time, the whole apartment building, maybe 50 people or so. And he said, Karin, when I came back one day crying because my girlfriend, who was 2 years older than I, 14, and there were 20 Russians who had raped her and made her father look on because they suspected him of being a Nazi. They put a bayonet in his head, and every time he closed his eyes, they stuck a little further. So he had to open his eyes again and see his daughter being raped. He said later on, he willed his mind to go away. She not only got pregnant, but she also, when she had an abortion, but she also had gotten syphilis, and there was no penicillin then for Germans. That came years later. So it was a torturous cure, and she was in horrible pain. And I was crying when I came home, and I said, the Russians, they're beasts, they're pigs, they're horrible. And this Ukrainian, who did not like the Russians, he did not want to be expatriated to Soviet Russia, but he said, if I just spoke to somebody, a captain, who was from the Ukraine, from my hometown, Kiev, and when they came through the eastern parts of Germany and saw the awful, awful things that had gone on in Auschwitz and the eastern concentration camps, I forgot the name now. It's in my book, actually, but I forgot the name of the Russian general who took Berlin. He said they could do whatever they wanted in 3 days. Vogelfrei, it's called in German. Free as a bird, you can rape, you can loot, you can commit any kind of crime you want for 3 days. And after that, order has to be restored. However, they started to loot and rape, and they kept drinking, and order was not restored. It was very, very dangerous for 1 month for a woman to be out in the street, and actually for 2 months until the Americans came in 2 months later, who the former enemy, we greeted them in the streets as our liberators. They were our liberators from the Russians. And then, of course, the Hunger Years began, and it was when the one thing that really made me think that nothing is permanent. My grandmother had a friend who was extremely wealthy. Her father had one of the biggest breweries in Berlin, in the Mark-Brandenburg, the province. And she was a very, very wealthy friend. And after the war, my grandmother visited her. She had been bombed out, and all her jewelry was in a bank vault, which was all taken by the Russians. The banks were looted by the Russians in the vaults, and then the villa that they had lived in, which was a fantastic estate, was bombed to the ground, and everything that was in there was gone. And she and her husband, she had no children, lived in a very small little apartment then, and he froze to death in his bed in the winter from 46 to 47. It was so cold. And she had very little jewelry left. It had all been in the safes, and it was gone. And the little she had left, my grandmother, who spoke English, of course, being an American and being a charming woman, went to Potsdamer Platz, which was a big black market place, and she sold the jewelry, hers and her friends, for a much better price to American soldiers who were really kind to her. They always gave her extra, and they gave her chocolate extra and this and that. So we helped her, but it wasn't enough. The cigarettes were our currency. We changed the cigarettes for butter and for bread to the Russians, who liked American cigarettes. And so we were able to live with the cigarettes stashed away like money. And we would get a guy to chop wood for us. I also chop wood. For 2 or 3 cigarettes, he would chop a whole load of wood. 1 pack of cigarettes was 1 pound of butter. 1 carton of cigarettes represented 1 carat diamond ring. The American soldiers who didn't smoke could get quite wealthy. They could get Leica cameras and wonderful Patek Philippe watches and diamonds and pearls and all of those things for their cigarette rations. So these were hard times, but I saw that if you're wealthy one day, if something happens like a war or anything else, any other upheaval, revolution, whatever it may be, tomorrow you may be poor, like the Winterfells, this woman who was my grandmother's friend. So it happened all over. So anyway, the people in West Germany, of course, they didn't get quite that poor, unless they had lost their houses, which many of them did. But it was a grim time for Germany, and Hamburg had the first horrible, horrible burning, when the whole city, practically the whole inner city burned down. It got so hot because they have the medieval old cities have narrow streets, and the asphalt got so hot that it would melt and you couldn't walk in it. You'd burn. You couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't flee the burning house. In Berlin, we could flee the burning houses because the streets were very wide, where we were bombed out, especially. Berlin is a new city. It was built around the latter part of the 18th century, but the other cities were old cities. Würzburg, awful. Dresden, up to about 300,000 people burnt to death, and they were melted. The bones were not found. They all melted into the foundations of the sandstone foundation of the building. They had this burning thing on them, this phosphor bombs is what we were bombed with, or the detonation bombs, and they would run into the Elbe River. And the minute they would come out on the other side of the Elbe River, they would burn again, because you cannot extinguish phosphor with water, so they slowly burned to death. It was lucky for those who drowned in the Elbe River not to emerge as burning flames. So, one more thing I wanted to say. I always wondered what happened. How did those Russians go into this church I'm describing, the Hochmeisterkirche, when it was burned out on the inside? And in 2002, my husband and I were in Berlin, and I wanted to find out. I was in the midst of writing this book. And we came in there, and there was a little coffee clutch going on with old people coming there twice a week, getting coffee and homemade cake in the afternoon. And most of these people were the age of my mother, or a little younger, but certainly a lot older than I. And they could inform me on what happened. They had lived in the same street as I all during the war and after the war. So I began to ask them. This woman invited me, who was the working for the church, invited me to join them. There were two long tables, and to ask them questions. And when I began asking them questions, they said, "Why do you want to know?" And I said, "I'm writing a book." "No, don't write about those times. They have to be forgotten. You cannot write about this. Promise me." And I said, "No, I would really like to find out from you, because in America people are interested what happened to the German people then." And one of them got very upset with the woman on my right, and she said to him, she was maybe 87, the other one might have been 90, I forgot now how old they were, they didn't tell me, but she said, "You voted for him too," meaning Hitler. "I did not. You did too." Like children, they argued. And then she said, "Well, then you voted for him the next time." Well, the other one said, "There was no next time. Do you remember? He was a dictator. There were no more elections." So another woman at the end of the table started to throw up all over the place. The memories of it must have been too much for her. She was probably one of the rape victims. The woman who had invited me in was now very busy with her, trying to clean her up, and she fainted also, and put her down on a bench. There was one young man there, well, he's maybe 35 or whatever, and I had wondered, why is this man there, eating cake and drinking coffee with all the old ladies? Well, later on, he got up and he said to me, "You're American." I said, "Yes, I'm American now." "The Americans were all pigs. They were much worse than the Russians." I was dumbfounded. for a moment I was speechless. I did not know what to say to him. I got up and I said, I beg your pardon. The Russians were who raped and were who horrible. I was there. The Americans were gentlemen. Not one raped. Not one. Not one stole or vandalized anything. They said they raped with cigarettes and with candies and perverted the German women, upon which two of the old women, I did not have to do this, two of the women jumped up, leapt at him. One of them took him by the neck, and the other one slapped him. Boom, boom. The poor woman who had been cleaning up the vomiter had to get up and free this man from these two women, peel them off of him. And so anyway, that was that story. He left, and I said, who is he? And they said, he's an Aussie. And in 1989, of course, that would have been, we were there 2002, that would have been several years earlier, over a decade earlier. He was probably a child in the East German equivalent of the Hitler Youth. The East Germans had the young communists, they wore little red neckties, and in the Hitler Youth they were black ones. And so that's where he grew up, to hate the Americans. But now he was out of a job, and he was hungry, and he came there to eat cake twice a week. So this is what you find in Berlin. So anyway, when we left the church, I saw that in the entry, it's an octagonal church, and the entrance, there are two winding stone staircases that go up into the tower. So that's how the Russians got in. Stone doesn't burn. So the church burned out, but the stone staircases and the stone foyer of the church where people first entered, that was intact. So one sometimes doubts one's own memory, but then you go back and you find, and I even went back to see the little sausage, the little butcher, and that later on was a sausage factory. Still the same smell, but it wasn't a butcher where you could buy meat anymore. It was a wholesale sausage factory that sold their sausages, but the white tiles were there, the blood on the tiles was there. Strange. So now I will say goodbye.